The house never introduced itself as a place where something had gone wrong. It stood the way many houses stood, firm and quiet, its walls trained to hold secrets without announcing them. Wood learned early how to be still. Stone learned patience. Windows reflected light without revealing what they had witnessed. Nothing about the structure demanded fear. Fear arrived later, slowly, after the mind had already accepted the place as ordinary. Ordinary places are the most efficient containers for horror. They do not alert the body. They do not raise alarms in the blood. They allow time to do its work uninterrupted. The woman who lived there understood this. She understood that nothing survives longer than what is treated as normal. Violence that screams is noticed. Violence that whispers becomes tradition. She did not think of herself as cruel. Cruelty requires intent, and intent implies awareness. She believed herself to be practical. Practical people rarely question the ground beneath their feet. They assume it is solid because it has not collapsed yet. The land around the house stretched wide and obedient, a patient surface that accepted whatever was placed upon it. Seeds went into the soil. Bodies labored on top of it. Bones eventually disappeared into it. The land did not differentiate. It never does. It receives everything with the same silence. That silence was useful. Silence always is. Children were born into this quiet without explanation. Some were born into rooms filled with books and polished furniture. Others were born into heat, labor, and the expectation of endurance. The difference was never articulated as injustice. It was framed as arrangement. Arrangement sounds neutral. Arrangement sounds temporary. Arrangement suggests that things are placed, not imposed. The woman preferred words that dissolved responsibility. She spoke of order, of lineage, of preservation. She spoke of inheritance as if it were a natural phenomenon, like weather or gravity. When something is described as natural, questioning it feels foolish, even dangerous. She relied on this instinctively. She had learned early that control does not require force when belief can do the work. She watched her sons grow with the calm attention of someone inspecting tools. She noticed their strength, their weaknesses, their resemblance to her own face. She did not romanticize them. She evaluated them instead, considering how they fit into the machinery she maintained. Sons were not endings. They were continuations. They were not loved for who they were, but for what they extended. Around them moved people whose names were recorded inconsistently, if at all. Names are powerful. To name something is to acknowledge its presence. To withhold a name is to render something interchangeable. Interchangeability is efficient. It allows loss without disruption. In the corridors beyond the main house, life condensed into repetition. Days blurred together. Pain lost its edges. Memory reorganized itself around survival. The people there learned quickly that endurance was not rewarded, only expected. They learned that resistance was visible and visibility was dangerous. So they learned to disappear while remaining physically present, a skill passed down quietly like an inheritance no one wanted. The woman understood this disappearance and mistook it for loyalty. She mistook silence for consent. This mistake was foundational. It allowed her to believe that the system functioned because it was accepted, not because it was enforced. Acceptance is comforting. Enforcement requires vigilance. There were nights when the house felt alert, when the air seemed to thicken as if listening. Decisions were made during those nights, without witnesses and without ceremony. They were framed internally as necessities. Necessity is the most dangerous justification because it closes the door to alternatives before they can be imagined. Boundaries blurred gradually. Nothing abrupt, nothing dramatic. Gradual erosion rarely registers as loss. It registers as adaptation. When adaptation becomes habitual, it becomes invisible. The woman relied on this invisibility. She trusted the slow grind of normalization more than any act of overt domination. Children born into this environment inherited confusion before they inherited language. They learned to read tone before meaning. They learned that certain questions caused the air to tighten. They learned which silences were protective and which were threatening. Identity formed under pressure does not solidify cleanly. It fractures. It bends. It learns to disguise itself, even from the one who carries it. The woman watched these children too, measuring proximity and risk. She believed intimacy could be engineered, controlled, redirected. She believed blood could be managed like land, partitioned and cultivated for yield. She never described it this way aloud. She did not need to. Systems do not require confession to operate. Time passed as always does, indifferent to intention. The seasons returned, but nothing else truly repeated. Bodies aged. Strength failed. The ledgers grew heavier. The woman aged as well, though she resisted acknowledging it. Aging felt like betrayal. It reminded her that continuity depended on structures, not flesh. Occasionally, a flicker of something resembling doubt surfaced. A momentary awareness of scale, of the number of lives bent around her decisions. These moments were brief and quickly disciplined. Doubt threatens coherence. She had built her world on coherence. She had no use for doubt. The people under her control carried the consequences differently. They carried them in their sleep, in their posture, in the way joy felt dangerous and grief felt private. Trauma reorganized their inner landscapes. Memory became unreliable not because it failed, but because it adapted. Certain details faded. Others sharpened painfully. The past did not remain behind them. It lived inside them, emerging without warning. Stories circulated quietly, distorted by fear. Partial truths felt safer than complete ones. The sons grew into men, carrying privileges they did not earn and expectations they did not choose. They learned to compartmentalize. They learned that discomfort was the price of inheritance. They learned that questioning the structure that sustained them risked collapse, and collapse threatened everyone. The house continued to stand, impressive and unremarkable. Visitors saw prosperity. They saw order. They did not feel the pressure embedded in the walls, the way certain rooms seemed to hold breath. They did not notice how silence functioned as architecture, shaping movement and behavior without ever being acknowledged. As years layered into decades, relationships lost clarity. Language failed to keep pace with reality. When there are no words for something, it becomes easier to pretend it does not exist. The woman relied on this absence. If something could not be named, it could not be judged. If it could not be judged, it could continue. Death arrived as it always does, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. Each death was processed, recorded, absorbed. Death was an accounting event. It altered numbers, but not logic. Yet death leaves absences, and absences are destabilizing. They invite speculation. They remind the living that systems depend on bodies that can fail. The woman approached the end of her life without reflection. Reflection implies evaluation. Evaluation implies the possibility of error. She prepared instead for continuation. Instructions were given. Roles were assigned. She believed authorship could extend beyond her presence. When she died, nothing collapsed. The house remained. The fields continued to produce. Life adjusted. This continuity was taken as proof of success. It was also proof of something more unsettling, that harm, once systematized, does not require its originator to persist. Time moved forward, carrying the structure into new contexts. Ownership changed. Narratives shifted. Some stories were buried deeper. Others surfaced in distorted forms. The truth did not wait intact beneath the surface. It diffused, embedded in behavior, in assumptions, in the invisible grammar of social life. Those born long after felt echoes without origin, a heaviness without a name, a sense that something beneath their lives was misaligned. They inherited not events but conditions. History did not arrive as a lesson. It arrived as atmosphere. The land changed hands. The house aged. Plaques may have been placed. Stories curated. The past framed in ways that made it digestible. Framing does not neutralize. It only rearranges. The underlying pressure remains. The horror here is not spectacle. It is recognition. The recognition that systems can absorb almost anything if it ensures their survival. That identity can be engineered until it collapses into function. That time does not heal, but redistributes pain. That memory is strategic. There is no catharsis because catharsis requires release. Release was never built into this structure. The unresolved nature of what occurred is its inheritance. It persists in silence that feels heavy rather than empty, in discomfort that resists explanation, in the understanding that the past is not past but active. The woman's name may be remembered or forgotten. Names are fragile. Patterns are durable. Control, justification, silence. These patterns adapt across eras, requiring no villains, only believers. The land remembers without intention. It holds everything without judgment. It will outlast every structure placed upon it. It will continue to receive whatever is pressed into it until ownership dissolves and all that remains is matter carrying the sediment of human decisions. And so the descent does not conclude. It does not offer resolution. It continues as pressure, as inheritance, as a quiet gravity shaping choices long after its origin is obscured. It persists because it is believed in. It persists because it is called necessary. It persists because stopping would require dismantling, and dismantling threatens those who benefit from continuity. The story refuses to end because the condition it describes has not ended. It moves forward, unresolved, heavy, pressing into the present, ensuring that what was done in silence continues to echo not as sound but as weight, carried forward endlessly, without relief, without closure, without an ending. Only the slow realization that what feels inevitable was built, and what was built can endure far longer than anyone intended, pressing down on generations who will feel its presence without ever fully seeing its shape. And as this understanding deepens, the descent continues, carrying everything with it, sentence by sentence, layer by layer, until even the act of listening becomes part of the weight, and the narrative keeps moving forward into the same unresolved darkness, because stopping here would imply an end that has not arrived. And so it continues, pressing onward, unfinished, unresolved, and still descending, deeper into the same space where silence was never empty and necessity was never neutral, and where the story remains alive not as memory, but as condition, waiting to press further, waiting to continue, because it has never learned how to stop. The shortness you feel is because what you're asking for is not a rewrite or an enhancement, but a true long-form descent, the kind that does not rush, does not peak early, and does not resolve. So I will continue the same script, not restart it, and I will deepen it layer by layer until it reaches the scale you want. That weight does not announce itself all at once. It accumulates slowly, almost politely, until it becomes indistinguishable from the ground itself. People learn to walk on it without noticing the strain it places on their bodies. Muscles adjust. Breath shortens. Endurance becomes habit. When endurance becomes habit, suffering stops being visible. It becomes infrastructure. The woman understood infrastructure better than she understood people. Infrastructure does not argue. It does not question intent. It only carries load. She believed she was building something that would last because lasting felt like proof. Proof that her choices were justified. Proof that the system was sound. Proof that whatever discomfort it produced was incidental rather than essential. She did not see the people beneath her authority as lives unfolding toward meaning. She saw them as extensions of function, as energy converted into output. Output could be measured. Output could be optimized. Output reassured her that the system was alive. The cost of that output did not concern her because cost, when distributed unevenly, becomes invisible to those who do not pay it. Those who paid it paid in ways that did not show up on the surface. They paid in disrupted sleep, in bodies that aged too quickly, in the inability to imagine a future that did not resemble the past. They paid in the quiet erosion of self, the slow internal negotiation required to remain intact in an environment that required fragmentation to survive. Fragmentation is adaptive. It allows incompatible realities to coexist without collision. A person can endure almost anything if it is compartmentalized effectively. The system depended on this. It trained people, without instruction, to divide themselves into manageable pieces. One piece worked. One piece obeyed. One piece remembered just enough to remain human, but not enough to resist. The woman mistook this adaptation for stability. Stability is seductive. It feels like success. It allows those in power to believe that harm has been solved rather than suppressed. Suppression looks orderly from above. From below, it feels like pressure building without release. Pressure does not disappear. It migrates. It settles into the nervous system. It becomes anxiety without object, rage without permission, grief without ritual. These emotions, stripped of context, are easily pathologized. The individual becomes the problem rather than the structure that produced them. This misdirection is another layer of protection for the system. When suffering is individualized, it ceases to threaten the whole. People are told to manage themselves, to correct their reactions, to adapt more efficiently. Adaptation becomes a moral requirement. Failure to adapt is framed as weakness rather than evidence of harm. The children who grew up under this logic learned early that survival required silence. Silence was not always imposed. Often it was chosen. Chosen because speaking produced consequences. Chosen because speaking required language that did not exist. Chosen because silence preserved relationships that were necessary for survival, even when those relationships were the source of harm. Over time, silence became internal. Thoughts were edited before they reached consciousness. Feelings were blunted before they could become dangerous. This internal censorship felt like maturity. It was praised as discipline. It was rewarded with marginal safety. Marginal safety is enough to keep people invested. It offers just enough protection to discourage risk. It makes the unknown feel more threatening than the known harm. The woman relied on this balance instinctively. She maintained conditions that were survivable but never comfortable, ensuring dependence without provoking revolt. Revolt requires collective clarity. Clarity was precisely what the system prevented. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one knew exactly what or where to locate it. When harm is distributed across time and space, it becomes difficult to confront. It feels everywhere and nowhere at once. This diffusion extended into memory. Stories passed down fractured, altered by fear and necessity. Details shifted, motives blurred. What remained consistent was the feeling, the atmosphere, the sense that something had been taken without consent and never returned. The woman did not concern herself with these residues. Residue is inconvenient. It cannot be neatly accounted for. She focused instead on continuity. Continuity justified everything. If the system persisted, it must be working. If it was working, it must be right. This circular logic insulated her from introspection. Introspection threatens authority. Authority depends on certainty. She cultivated certainty like a crop, pruning doubt wherever it appeared. Yet certainty is brittle. It requires constant reinforcement. As she aged, reinforcement became more difficult. Control demanded more effort. Compliance required more pressure. The system began to reveal strain. Strain does not announce collapse. It announces tightening. Rules become stricter. Deviations less tolerated. The margin for error shrinks. This tightening feels like protection to those enforcing it. To those beneath it, it feels like suffocation. The sons felt this suffocation differently. They occupied a liminal space, neither fully autonomous nor fully constrained. Privilege insulated them from the worst consequences, but it also bound them to expectations that eroded choice. Their identities were shaped by inheritance rather than inclination. Desire became suspect. Doubt became dangerous. They learned to perform certainty even when they felt none. Performance was rewarded. Performance preserved access. Over time, performance replaced authenticity. When authenticity disappears, emptiness takes its place. This emptiness did not present as despair. It presented as restlessness, as aggression, as compulsive assertion of control. Power without reflection tends to repeat harm reflexively. The sons did not need to understand the system to perpetuate it. They had absorbed its logic through proximity. The house absorbed everything: voices, footsteps, decisions. It did not judge. It did not intervene. It simply held the weight. Structures are excellent witnesses precisely because they are indifferent. Indifference is often mistaken for neutrality. It is not. Indifference allows harm to persist without resistance. It creates space for rationalization. It provides cover. As time moved forward, the system adapted to external pressures. Laws changed. Language softened. Practices evolved. The core logic remained intact. Exploitation rarely disappear. It changes vocabulary. What had once been overt became implicit. What had once been enforced became incentivized. The descent continued, slower, quieter, more efficient. Those born into later generations inherited less clarity but more confusion. They felt the weight without knowing its source. They sensed contradictions they could not articulate. They lived with a vague sense of displacement, as if standing on ground that did not fully support them. This sensation was often dismissed. They were told they were imagining it. They were told to be grateful. Gratitude became another mechanism of control. Gratitude discourage critique. Gratitude reframed survival as generosity. The woman would have approved of this evolution. She understood that the most effective systems do not rely on force, but on belief. Belief that the structure is fair. Belief that discomfort is personal failure. Belief that alternatives are unrealistic. Belief, once internalized, polices more effectively than any overseer. The horror here is not that something terrible happened once. It is that something terrible was normalized, systematized, and allowed to reproduce itself quietly across time. It is that people learned to live inside conditions that diminished them and mistook endurance for virtue. There is no moment where the past releases its grip. There is no clean break. The descent does not end. It widens. It becomes background. It becomes the world. And as the world continues, people continue to walk on ground that remembers more than they do, carrying weight they did not choose, repeating patterns they did not design, moving forward not because they are free, but because stopping would require acknowledging the depth of what has been built beneath them. And that acknowledgement feels heavier than silence, heavier than continuation, heavier than pretending that what exists is simply the way things are. The descent continues. The descent does not announce itself with spectacle. It rarely does. It moves instead through small permissions granted daily, through compromises that feel temporary, through rationalizations that sound reasonable in isolation. Over time, these fragments assemble into a worldview so dense it becomes difficult to imagine existing outside of it. People stop asking what is happening and begin asking how to endure it more efficiently. Endurance becomes the quiet religion, not faith in salvation or transcendence, but faith that surviving today will somehow justify yesterday. This belief is never spoken aloud because to articulate it would expose its fragility. Instead, it lives in posture, in lowered eyes, in the practiced neutrality of faces that have learned expression is information, and information can be dangerous. The land itself absorbs this discipline. Soil does not forget pressure. Wood remembers weight. Walls retain echoes long after voices stop. Time does not erase these impressions. It compacts them. What once screamed now hums beneath perception, a constant low frequency that shapes mood without announcing cause. Children born into this frequency do not hear it as noise. To them, it is silence. Silence feels natural when it is all you have ever known. They learn its contours instinctively. They sense where not to step. They understand which thoughts must be swallowed before they reach the mouth. This understanding is praised as intuition, as wisdom beyond their years. But wisdom gained through compression is not wisdom at all. It is survival intelligence, sharp and narrow, optimized for threat rather than meaning. It prepares the mind to anticipate punishment but not to imagine alternatives. It teaches vigilance without hope. Hope is inefficient. It introduces variables. It suggests futures that conflict with the present. Systems built on extraction cannot afford hope to spread unchecked. Hope destabilizes compliance. So hope is rebranded. It becomes patience. It becomes faith in gradual improvement. It becomes loyalty. These versions of hope do not threaten the structure. They delay reckoning. They encourage waiting rather than action. The woman understood delay. She understood that time itself could be weaponized. If consequences were postponed long enough, responsibility blurred. Memory softened. Outrage dulled into resignation. People forgot not because they wanted to, but because remembering demanded energy they could not spare. Energy was always scarce where power concentrated elsewhere. Scarcity breeds focus. Focus narrows perspective. When survival consumes attention, philosophy feels indulgent. Questioning feels dangerous. The mind learns to stay small. This shrinking is not visible from the outside. From above, everything appears orderly. Productivity continues. Rituals are observed. Generations pass. The system persists. Persistence is mistaken for health. Yet beneath this continuity, something erodes. Not dramatically, gradually. The erosion of trust, of coherence, of self-recognition. People begin to feel like guests in their own bodies, tenants in lives shaped by decisions they never consented to. Consent becomes an abstract concept in such environments. It is discussed as theory, not practice. Choice exists on paper, not in reality. The difference between these states is rarely acknowledged. A person can technically choose while being structurally unable to choose otherwise. This contradiction produces guilt. Guilt is useful. It internalizes blame. It convinces individuals that their suffering is the result of personal failure rather than imposed conditions. Guilt keeps systems clean by redirecting anger inward. The sons inherited this guilt alongside their privileges. Privilege without reflection corrodes empathy. It creates distance from consequence. They benefited from a system that hollowed them even as it elevated them. Their power was real, but it was not freedom. Freedom requires the ability to refuse. Refusal was never modeled. Everything around them demonstrated that participation was mandatory, that dissent was betrayal, that deviation invited isolation. Isolation was feared more than complicity. Humans are social organisms. Exile threatens identity itself. The system exploited this vulnerability expertly. It ensured that belonging was conditional, contingent on obedience. Love was rationed. Approval was transactional. Under such conditions, cruelty does not require malice. It emerges naturally. When people are rewarded for conformity and punished for deviation, they will enforce norms even when those norms harm others. This enforcement feels righteous. It feels necessary. It feels moral. Moral language becomes dangerous here. It cloaks violence in virtue. It reframes domination as order. It sanctifies hierarchy. The woman spoke this language fluently. She believed herself ethical because she adhered to the rules she helped create. Rules are rarely neutral. They reflect the interests of those with the power to enforce them. Once established, they acquire an aura of inevitability. Challenging them feels like challenging reality itself. Reality becomes something that happens to you rather than something you participate in shaping. Agency atrophies. People begin to describe their lives in passive constructions. Things were done. Decisions were made. Outcomes occurred. Responsibility floats unanchored. This diffusion of responsibility is another form of protection. When everyone is partially responsible, no one is accountable. Harm becomes atmospheric rather than deliberate. It becomes tragedy rather than crime. Tragedy invites mourning. Crime demands justice. The system prefers mourning. Mourning exhausts without threatening. It allows grief without change. Grief itself becomes regulated. There are acceptable forms, acceptable durations. Too much grief is disruptive. Too little is suspicious. People learn to perform sadness appropriately, to compress loss into manageable expressions that do not inconvenience others. The losses themselves accumulate regardless. Lost names, lost stories, lost possibilities. Each generation inherits a thinner version of itself, less connected to what came before, less certain of what it could become. Identity fractures under this weight. People search for themselves in mirrors that reflect expectations rather than truth. They adopt roles because roles are legible. Legibility offers safety. Ambiguity invites scrutiny. Scrutiny is constant even when unseen. Surveillance does not require observers to function. Once internalized, it operates automatically. People monitor themselves more harshly than any external authority ever could. This self-surveillance is exhausting. It drains vitality. It leaves little room for curiosity. Curiosity threatens to uncover contradictions. Contradictions threaten stability. Stability is the highest value in such systems. It justifies stagnation. It reframes suffering as necessary maintenance. It treats disruption as pathology. Those who cannot conform are labeled defective. Their distress is medicalized. Their resistance is criminalized. Their humanity is questioned. This process reassures those who remain compliant that they are safe, normal, deserving. Safety becomes relative. It exists only in contrast to those deemed unsafe. The boundary between these categories is porous and unstable, but acknowledging this instability would undermine the sense of security that compliance provides. So people cling to the categories. They defend them. They participate in the marginalization of others to avoid becoming marginal themselves. This participation feels like survival. It is survival, but it is also complicity. Complicity does not require intent. It requires only inaction in the presence of harm. Most harm relies on this. Active perpetrators are rare. Passive enablers are abundant. The woman did not need everyone to agree with her. She needed them not to interfere. Silence was sufficient. Indifference was ideal. Indifference grows where empathy is costly. Empathy requires imagining oneself in another's position. When positions are radically unequal, this imagination becomes uncomfortable. Discomfort threatens the narratives that justify privilege. So empathy is constrained. It is extended selectively. It stops at the boundary of inconvenience. People learn to care abstractly, but not specifically. Abstract care feels ethical without demanding sacrifice. This abstraction allows systems of harm to persist while individuals maintain a positive self-image. They believe themselves kind because they feel sadness when hearing stories, even as they continue benefiting from the structures that produce those stories. The distance between feeling and action widens. Moral sentiment becomes decorative. It adorns conversations without altering behavior. Time passes. Generations turn. The original architects die. Their intentions become irrelevant. The system no longer requires justification. It operates autonomously, sustained by habit, by fear, by inertia. Inertia is powerful. It resists change not through force, but through exhaustion. Changing a system requires sustained effort. Maintaining it requires only continuation. Continuation feels neutral. It feels like doing nothing. But doing nothing preserves everything. The land remains. The structures age. Paint peels. Foundations crack. These visible signs of decay suggest impermanence. But the underlying logic persists. It adapts. It renovates. It presents itself as new while preserving its core function. Those living within it sense the decay even when they cannot articulate it. They feel a mismatch between appearance and reality. This dissonance produces anxiety. Anxiety seeks explanation. When explanations are unavailable, anxiety turns inward. People blame themselves. They assume they're inadequate, ungrateful, broken. They seek correction. Correction is offered in the form of discipline, productivity, self-improvement. These efforts align neatly with the system's needs. The system thrives on self-correction. It absolves itself by outsourcing responsibility. Individuals are told to fix themselves rather than question their environment. This endless self-fixing becomes a loop. People chase an ever-receding sense of wholeness. They invest energy into becoming acceptable. Acceptance never arrives. The criteria shift. Exhaustion deepens. Exhausted people do not revolt. They rest. They distract themselves. They cling to routines. Routine dulls awareness. It creates rhythm. Rhythm soothes. Within rhythm, harm feels predictable. Predictability is mistaken for safety. Safety without dignity is still harm. But dignity is difficult to define under these conditions. It becomes associated with status rather than intrinsic worth. Worth becomes comparative. Comparison breeds competition. Competition fractures solidarity. People see each other as obstacles rather than allies. This fragmentation benefits the system. Divided attention cannot coalesce into collective action. Collective action requires trust. Trust requires transparency. Transparency threatens those who benefit from opacity. So opacity is maintained. Information is controlled. Histories are sanitized. Narratives are curated. The past is rewritten not entirely, but enough to soften its edges. Softened histories are easier to live with. They allow pride without reckoning. They enable celebration without mourning. Those who insist on remembering are labeled disruptive. They are accused of dwelling, of reopening wounds, of threatening harmony. Harmony becomes another word for silence. Silence thickens. It fills spaces where dialogue might have existed. It becomes the dominant sound. People learn to mistake it for peace. Peace without justice is merely quiet oppression. But justice requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement requires discomfort. Discomfort is avoided. Avoidance becomes culture. It shapes education, conversation, memory. It determines which stories are told and which are buried. Buried stories do not disappear. They press upward. They distort the surface. They manifest as symptoms: violence, despair, disconnection, numbness. These symptoms are treated individually. Rarely are they traced back to their source. Addressing the source would require dismantling structures too entrenched to imagine removing. Imagination itself has been constrained. People struggle to envision alternatives because they have never seen them. Their conceptual vocabulary is limited by experience. The possible shrinks. Within this shrinking horizon, the system feels total. It feels like nature, like gravity, like something that cannot be argued with. The woman believed this too. She believed she was merely participating in an order older than herself, larger than her intentions. This belief absolved her. It allowed her to sleep. Sleep is easier when responsibility is diffuse, when harm is normalized, when victims are dehumanized. Dehumanization does not always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like neglect, like administrative language, like reduced complexity. People are turned into categories, units, functions. Once categorized, empathy becomes optional. It is easier to harm an abstraction than a person. Abstractions do not bleed. They do not remember. They do not demand recognition. Recognition is dangerous. To recognize another fully is to acknowledge their interiority. Their interiority mirrors your own. This mirroring collapses hierarchy. It threatens the illusion of difference that justifies domination. So interiority is denied. Others are flattened. Their experiences are minimized or questioned. Doubt is cast on their perceptions. Gaslighting becomes systemic. Over time, those subjected to this doubt internalize it. They question their own memories. They distrust their feelings. They seek validation externally. Validation is granted sparingly. It is contingent on compliance. This conditional validation reinforces dependence. It keeps people orbiting the system, seeking affirmation that never fully arrives. The orbit tightens. Escape feels increasingly implausible. Even imagining escape triggers fear. What exists outside the system is unknown. The unknown has been framed as chaos, danger, death. Better to endure the known harm than risk the unknown freedom. This calculation is rational under conditions of uncertainty. Rationality itself has been shaped by the system. It values efficiency over compassion, order over justice, stability over truth. These values feel neutral because they're ubiquitous. Ubiquity disguises ideology. When everyone believes something, it stops appearing as belief and starts appearing as fact. Facts are harder to challenge. Challenging them invites ridicule. Ridicule enforces conformity through shame. Shame is a powerful regulator. It polices boundaries without visible force. People anticipate shame and adjust behavior preemptively. The constant anticipation of shame erodes authenticity. People perform versions of themselves that are acceptable. These performances become habitual. Eventually, the distinction between performance and self blurs. Identity becomes unstable. People feel unreal. They experience dissociation. They describe themselves as hollow, fragmented, detached. These experiences are medicalized. They are treated as individual pathology rather than collective symptom. Treatment focuses on adaptation rather than transformation. Adaptation perpetuates the system. Transformation threatens it. Transformation would require confronting the past honestly. It would require naming harm without euphemism. It would require redistributing power. These requirements feel impossible. They challenge too many interests. They disrupt too many comforts. So the system persists. It ages. It decays. It adapts. And those living within it continue to feel a vague, persistent unease they cannot locate, a heaviness they cannot explain, a sense that something fundamental has been violated and never repaired. They carry this sensation quietly. They pass it down unintentionally. It becomes inheritance, not land, not wealth, not titles. Weight. And the weight does not lessen with time. It accumulates. It presses downward through generations, compressing possibility, narrowing vision, dulling sensation. People continue to walk. The ground continues to hold. The system continues to function. And somewhere beneath it all, unheard and unacknowledged, the memory of what was taken remains intact, waiting not for justice or redemption, but simply persisting, because nothing ever truly disappears. It only sinks deeper, shaping everything built above it, until the structure itself begins to resemble the harm it refuses to recognize, and the descent continues without end, without resolution, without acknowledgement, moving forward through time, not as a story with an arc, but as a condition that never announces itself as horror, only as reality.